All right, welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor. I am your host, Meta, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about Russian intercepts of U.S. aircraft and U.S. intercepts of Russian aircraft and all those kind of things. And then we'll be diving into a little bit of a discussion about mastery versus learning. We'll get started in a sec, but in the meantime, go to Instagram, push the like button, follow me on Instagram, follow me on YouTube, Fighter Pilot Professor. And if you're listening, and then obviously you know where to find this podcast. So keep shooting me your questions. We'll jump right in.
Welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast. I'm your host, Meta. And in the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast, every week we examine world events and your daily life through the mind of a fighter pilot. The episodes answer your questions harnessing my experience in 25 years of flying fighter jets and my PhD in history, policy, and strategy. You can tune in wherever you find your favorite podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and on YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor.
All right, so not too long ago, a video of a Russian aircraft flying very closely, uncomfortably closely to a U.S. F-16 off the coast of Alaska came out. And so I thought that I'd talk a little bit about this because people ask me a little bit about like what's going on there, what's happening, is this dangerous, etc. And the answer is yes. The way this intercept in particular was operated was dangerous. But in general, this sort of thing happens all the time, not this super close pass. And I'll talk about the close pass here in a sec. But in the background of the photos and videos that you see when you watch this incident, you'll see a Russian Bear bomber flying along, and the F-16 in question intercepted this Bear bomber. And so this happens regularly. U.S. aircraft, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, routinely fly near other nations doing whatever it is that they do. And they are often intercepted by aircraft from those nations. And if you have a long memory and been around long enough like me, you remember all the way back, for example, in 2000, where Chinese aircraft collided with a U.S. P-3 aircraft in the South China Sea. And the P-3 actually crash landed into Yan'an Island. And then sort of in more recent history, we've seen Russian aircraft intercept and knock down U.S. Predator or Reaper aircraft in the Black Sea near the Ukraine during the Russian-Ukraine war there. We've seen similar things in the Mediterranean, in Iraq and Syria, et cetera, et cetera. And so these kind of intercepts, these intercepts happen. And so I'll talk a little bit about like why do they happen. So the first thing is this map here shows the U.S. ADIZ, or Air Defense Identification Zone. So really what this is typically about 200 miles off the coast of the United States, aircraft are supposed to be able to be positively identified. If you are not positively identified in that bubble, then you will most likely be intercepted. And then international law states that maritime and airspace, the sovereign territory of a nation extends out into a 12-mile buffer in both the water and in the air, right? So I can't go into another nation's airspace, but I can fly up to 12 miles, or I have to say outside of 12 miles from that boundary, right? And so what we see a lot of times is, in the case of Russian aircraft and our NATO allies, or Russian aircraft in the U.S. off the coast of Alaska, for example, is they will fly into this air defense identification zone and basically right up to that 12, so like 12.1 miles from the U.S. border, right? And because they've flown into that air defense identification zone and they haven't obviously identified themselves and they're approaching the territory of the United States, then we send up aircraft to intercept them. And, nations do this for all sorts of reasons, to collect intelligence, et cetera, just to sort of provoke other nations, right? To gauge their response. There's a myriad of military and political diplomatic reasons why we would do such things. But just know that it's fairly common, right? And so what typically happens is U.S. aircraft will go up and intercept these Russian aircraft, and from time to time, the Russian bomber aircraft have fighter escorts. So in this case, in this particular instance that happened recently, the aircraft in question was a flanker, Russian flanker aircraft, as we call it in NATO parlance, right? This is a long-range air superiority fighter that the Russians have. It's similar in size and capabilities to the U.S. F-15. And it's a very capable aircraft. And in this particular video, we see the Russian fighter pilot approach the F-16 aggressively and very close aboard. The point of this maneuver is intending to sort of chase away, for lack of a better way to put it, the intercepting F-16 aircraft. And this sort of thing happens all the time, or I hate to say this sort of thing, but these sort of cat and mouse games between escorting fighters and intercepting fighters happen, where now the intercept becomes more about dealing with the other fighters than observing the bomber or reconnaissance aircraft. And so now you have these other fighters out there that you have to deal with, right? And typically the fighter aircraft will sort of try to intervene between the intercepting aircraft and the aircraft and the bomber or reconnaissance airplane that's following along. And that's what this Russian fighter is attempting to do, is sort of intervene between the U.S. intercepting aircraft and the bomber itself, the Bear bomber. So for the most part, both U.S. FAA, so Federal Aviation Administration, and the ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, dictate that 500 feet is considered safe distance for two aircraft to be. And 500 feet is pretty close. I can determine a lot about an aircraft by flying 500 feet from it. I can see typically, the pilot, the silhouette at least of the pilot in the cockpit. I can see details about what type of aircraft, if it's carrying any ordnance and that kind of thing, right? In some cases, these intercepts do get a little bit closer than 500 feet, but typically speaking, 500 feet is sort of the safe distance away. In this case with the Russian aircraft and the F-16, and we've seen other instances where Russian aircraft have come pretty close to U.S. and other NATO allied aircraft, and most of the time these are, give or take, around 100 feet or so. But in this particular case, again, it's hard to tell exactly from the video because the shape of the camera is a little bit distorted, but I would say that the Russian aircraft passes somewhere between like 10 and 20 feet from the U.S. F-16. And the reason why I gauge that is because just like looking out at what I can see on the Russian aircraft itself, I can see into the cockpit of the Russian airplane. I can see very fine details. And this looks very similar to sort of a close formation that airplanes would use when they're flying in sort of fighter aircraft anyways would use when they're flying in sort of an administrative phase of flight. They're sort of flying to the airspace or from the airspace from practicing or whatever. So that means that this Russian aircraft gets very close to the U.S. F-16, and they're maneuvering very aggressively. So you see that in the video, if you watch the video of it, you'll see that the Russian airplane actually pulls into the F-16 and causes the F-16 to sort of flinch away, which I don't blame them for doing that. So, all in all, the U.S. announced that this was an unprofessional intercept, and I would agree with that, especially considering that intercepts of aircraft, both Russian, U.S., and other allies, happens all the time. And it's usually no big deal, but in this case, it seems to be a big deal. So as always, keep shooting me your questions so we can talk more about the things you want to talk about. You can like me and follow me on Instagram, the Fighter Pilot Professor, and on YouTube, same, Fighter Pilot Professor. And as always, get in your podcast wherever you find them. All right, so today I wanted to talk a little bit about mastery versus learning. And and this is sort of in the same vein as the discussion we had about perfect being the enemy of good. And, in this particular case, and we talked a little bit about it and other things of like learned skills versus inherent skills and that kind of stuff, right? Where like, how good is good enough, right? How good do I actually have to be at something, right? And is being a learner okay, right? And so obviously, in some cases, I want to strive towards mastery, right? In profession as being a fighter pilot, for example, I would like to strive towards mastery of that, right? It's the consequences for not mastering or approaching mastery of that task are steep. But in some cases, right, like I don't really need to be that good. I don't need to be a master. If I want to go out and ride a bike or run or ski or whatever, like I'm not going to be a professional downhill skier. So like I don't necessarily have to master those skills. I can be a lifelong learner. Similarly, if I want to learn to play the guitar, play piano, whatever, right? I may not ever go on to do that professionally. It may not be the thing that puts food on my table. And so from that perspective, it sort of doesn't matter if I am a master, right? And so from that perspective, if I'm doing this thing that doesn't really matter if I'm going to be a master at it, then I can take up the role of being a lifelong learner. And this is why, in my opinion, this is important. Like setting aside the mastery of things that are important, like if you're going to be a fighter pilot, you want to, not die. You better get close to mastering that thing. But hey, if I'm just going to play guitar for fun, then I can pick up the mentality of being a lifelong learner, and this will help me sort of decrease my frustration, for lack of a better way to put it, when I've hit the wall of my capability, right? And so what I can do is, as I go along learning this new skill, whatever it is, I can say, oh, hey, I've kind of hit this wall, and so I can just proceed with the idea that, well, I'm just going to keep working on where I am, and hopefully I can learn a little bit incremental at a time. And sure, it might be frustrating right now because I'm not advancing at the rate that I once was. I can be happy at the level that I'm at, and I will find satisfaction in doing the thing that I'm doing at where I'm at, right? So if I'm learning to ski, then hey, I'm going to recognize my limits and I'm just going to ski on the green slopes or whatever, right? I may not make it to the black slopes yet. And often, and we get frustrated because we want to, I want to be good at this thing. And especially for those of us type A's out there, right? I want to be good at this thing. And why am I not? I should be able to do this right away. But that mentality will often lead to a lot of frustration. And if you are not ever intending on being a professional at this thing, right? Because what that means, if you're not intending on being a professional, is you're never going to invest the time and effort that it's going to take to be a professional, right? You remember we talked a long time ago about the grind and all that kind of stuff, but like the big picture is, if I'm going to make something my profession, then I'm going to invest a lot of time, especially if it is dangerous or requires a lot of high skill. Then I'm going to invest a lot of time, and I'm going to pay the price that it takes to be really good at that. But if I'm never going to be a professional at that thing, do I really want to pay that price? And then most of the time the answer is no. And if the answer is no, then I'm just going to take up this lifelong learner mentality around it, and I'm just going to get sort of incrementally better. And some days will be better than others, and some days I'll just have to be like, well, today, I lost 15 golf balls and shot 103 on the golf course or whatever, right? Today I'm not going to be able to ski a black, whatever it is, and I'm just going to be happy doing this thing at this lower level, right? Because frankly, if you're not going to be happy, then why are you doing it to begin with if you're not going to invest the time at being a professional, right? So in my opinion, there's sort of it's a binary selection. I'm either investing the time to be a professional, or I'm being happy being a lifelong learner. And what you'll find, in my opinion, is that you'll be much happier being a lifelong learner if you're not going to invest the time, right? So you'll be a lifelong learner, you'll peak, you'll hit plateaus, you'll have up and down days. Some days will be really, really good, some days will be not as good, and just enjoy the thing that you're doing, right? And that's really the point of what it is: reading, playing music, golfing, whatever, right? And you'll find that I think that you'll get much more satisfaction from the thing rather than always trying to be perfect if you just take up that lifelong learner mentality. That's my 2 cents. As always, I'd really like it if you keep shooting me your questions, keep shooting me ideas, the things you want to talk about. You can like and follow me on Instagram and YouTube, Fighter Pilot Professor. And as always, keep listening wherever you find your podcasts. Have a good one.